Continuity and change from Ford. Okay, as I was saying, continuity and change from Ford to Carter. There's a good look at our new president, Gerald Ford, who takes over for Nixon, who resigns under pressure from the Watergate scandal. What do we know about Gerald Ford? Well, first of all, Ford is a longtime member of the House of Representatives from Michigan. He's a former college athlete, really good football player, and he's a Navy veteran from World War II. And he is known for his hard work and his honesty. So why Gerald Ford? Well, he was appointed to replace Spiro Agnew as vice president under Nixon in 1973 when Spiro Agnew got into some major tax evasion problems. It's a move to try to bring credibility to Nixon's Watergate problem. Ford is a conservative, but he's moderate. He's not too far on the right, and he's a very modest individual, and you know, he's somebody that people can relate to, but he is a clumsy guy, and he doesn't always look good. First thing he's going to do is he's going to pardon Richard Nixon. Now, why do that? Well, first of all, he's going to forgive Nixon. Nixon was not really involved in the Watergate break-in. His crime was that he covered it up. The whole idea is to keep the nation from being dragged through some long, stupid trial because the pardon will keep Nixon out of jail, and it'll keep a trial from even happening. But there are a lot of Americans who think that Richard Nixon should be punished for covering up the Watergate burglary and other associated crimes. Many people think it was prearranged prior to Ford becoming president. So it's time to move on and to maintain the aura of the presidency. Okay, so let's look at Ford as president. His presidency overall is not very effective. We've got the lingering effects of the Nixon Watergate scandal, but even more so, we have inflation carrying over from the 60s with the Vietnam War. The economy is in crisis, and of course, the OPEC oil boycotts will create energy problems for the country. So overall, it is the economy that will create problems for the Ford presidency. As far as foreign policy goes, Ford will continue Nixon's détente approach to keep the tensions low with the Soviet Union, try to peacefully coexist. He's going to keep Henry Kissinger on as his foreign policy advisor for that continuity, and they will have some success with setting up a second SALT treaty to reduce nuclear arms. There's also going to be discussions to continue to open up trade with China. We talked about that before, that Nixon had opened trade with China. Other foreign policy, this is when South Vietnam will actually collapse and fall to the Viet Cong, who had controlled the countryside for the past 7 or 8 years. So North Vietnam, along with the Viet Cong, will capture Saigon in the spring of '75, ending the 10-year Vietnam War. The United States had pulled out of there 2 years prior to that. Congress was not willing to re-enter the war, although some money was appropriated to get our American ambassadors and people close to our country out of South Vietnam. Probably the biggest foreign policy incident will be the Mayaguez incident, where an American merchant vessel will be seized by the Khmer Rouge, which is running Cambodia. We'll end up sending the Marines in. People will get killed. So it's not a great situation there. The 1976 election is the year of the bicentennial for the country. Ford has been overall pretty ineffective with the economy, the inflation, the unemployment, the lingering Nixon pardon issues. Basically, there's a pretty strong distrust of Republicans at this time, and America is ready for a change, which sets the stage for a little-known peanut farmer by the name of Jimmy Carter, who is an outsider, to win the 1976 election. So who is this Jimmy Carter, James Carter? Well, he's also a former naval officer. He's got a degree in nuclear physics. He's a peanut farmer. He's a governor of Georgia. And he is a very strict Baptist. Has little knowledge of what happens inside of Washington, D.C., but that makes him appealing. He is an outsider, or Washington outsider. So what's his appeal? Well, first of all, he's big into the environment and ecology. He is a strong supporter of human rights. He wants efficiency in government, and he believes in removing racial barriers. He appeals to many, again, because he is, quite frankly, from outside of Washington. So what happens during his domestic policy? Well, inflation is going to continue to grow. It's going to go up to 9%, which is pretty high. We're going to have stagflation, which means that along with the inflation, we are going to have no economic growth, high unemployment. All of this is going to really rackle his presidency. It's going to kind of hold it down. He's going to try to deal with the economy through wage and price controls. He's also going to try and start some public works program, but nothing really seems to work. OPEC is going to create problems again. They will raise prices again in '79. We're going to get the long gas lines again. You're going to be told you can only get gas on every other day. You're only going to get X quantity of gas. And so this whole energy crisis really puts a damper on things. As you know, previously, under Nixon, they reduced the speed limit to 55. Nobody can hang Christmas tree lights outside. It's really a downer, and so it puts a damper on his presidency. As far as foreign policy goes, I mentioned human rights. Reminds me a lot of Woodrow Wilson. He's a very highly moralistic person who wants to apply those high morals to foreign policy. That's great, except that in a practical world, most of these countries are not going to necessarily listen. But what he wants to do is deal only with countries that have a good human rights record. He wants to get away from the shady dealings of the Nixon-Ford years that are tied to Vietnam. And he only wants to work with those countries that have a good human rights record. But sometimes that doesn't work out. One of the things he wants to do is he thinks it's only the right thing to do to return the Panama Canal to the Panamanians. This is a treaty that will pass barely in the Congress. One of the opponents to that treaty will be Ronald Reagan. He is going to set up the first U.S. embassy in China, which will continue to improve our relations with communist China. And he's going to continue to work on the SALT II treaty, but that's not going to pass because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan later in his presidency in '79. One of his major accomplishments in foreign policy is the Middle East. He brokered a deal there. It's called the Camp David Accords. He's actually going to win a Nobel Peace Prize for that. He's going to try and bring Egypt and Israel together. Unfortunately, that's a very short-lived accomplishment, and the PLO is going to shift. The Palestinian Liberation Organization is going to shift back towards terrorism. You're going to see Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, murdered, and then on top of that, Things are going to get really hot in '79 when the Soviets invade Afghanistan. Carter's going to respond by boycotting the 1980 Olympics in the Soviet Union, and he's going to cancel SALT II talks. Oh, check that picture out. What does that remind you of? Yes, probably the biggest crisis, though, is the Iranian hostage crisis. Well, you know, the U.S. had supported the Shah of Iran for years, and you know he's not all that nice of a guy, has a pretty lousy human rights record, and we put him in power back in the 40s after World War II when we were worried that the Soviets were going to move into that area. The Shah had westernized Iran and had been working with the U.S. in terms of getting us oil. But by this time, the Shah has been booted out of Iran, and the fundamentalist movement has taken over with the Ayatollah Khomeini coming out of exile. Excuse me. And so during this whole mess, student revolutionaries are going to take over the embassy, and they're going to take 52 hostages, and they're going to demand that the U.S. return the Shah, because he's over here in the States getting medical treatment for cancer. Well, those hostages are going to be held for 444 days, and this is going to be a real blot on Carter's foreign policy record. There are other issues with human rights. Besides Iran, the U.S. has continued to support the leaders in the Philippines where torture and murder have gone on. The government of the U.S. continues to support rebels in Nicaragua that are trying to overthrow a democratically elected socialist government. In Indonesia, you have the Indonesian government that we're supporting killing people left and right in East Timor. So even though Carter is pushing human rights, the country is still working closely with countries that have a bad human rights record. So it's somewhat of a blot on his foreign policy. And so in the end, it's this poor foreign policy record, especially not getting the hostages back, that are going to really hurt him as he goes into the 1980 election. You throw that in with the lousy economic conditions, and yep, Carter's going to get beat by, yep, there he is, Ronald Reagan. And Mr. Conservative will run and win 51% of the vote. The first true majority president since 1964. Welcome to the conservative resurgence.